Hello and welcome to the Spotlight. UK's state-owned broadcaster, the BBC, has admitted that there were serious flaws in the documentary on an alleged 2018 chemical attack in Syria, 3 years after the incident occurred. Why would the BBC come out now and cast doubt on the accuracies of the findings? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at how flawed info such as this led to the US, Britain, and France launching bombing raids in Syria. Did they use flawed intel or fake news to continue the war in Syria?
UK's national broadcaster, the BBC, has admitted that its documentary on an alleged 2018 chemical weapon attack in Syrian city of Douma contained serious inaccuracies. The program reported that a former inspector with the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog had expressed doubts over the organization's stance on the incident. The watchdog, in its probe into the incident, had blamed it on the Syrian government, a charge Damascus denied. The BBC program claimed the inspector was motivated to go public about his doubts in return for getting financial reward from the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. Now, the British Broadcasting Corporation has accepted that it had no evidence to back up that claim. Also, WikiLeaks has said such a reward was never paid.
The excuse of chemical weapons was used in Syria again and again. In 2012, 2013, it was used for the sanctions on Syria. It was used for the U.S. beginning military actions. The latest expose in Douma in 2018 was at a time when every report said Syria was clearly winning the war. And that was why this massive new level of bombardment, happened. They just found a new story. All of the media used it. Hundreds and hundreds of news articles from every direction screamed about it. And now we find it's just a fabrication.
It's surprisingly rare for the BBC to rule against itself. The recent confession is hailed as a major victory for truth.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. We have activist, historian, and investigative journalist, who is a former BBC employee, Tony Gosling, joining us from Bristol. Also joining us, journalist and political analyst John Bosnitch, who joins us from Belgrade. I'd like to welcome you both, and I'm going to start with you, Tony Gosling, if I may. Tell us what has happened here. You have an incident that happened in 2018, briefly, if you can touch on that for us, and why you think that at this point you have the BBC coming out saying what it's saying in terms of inaccuracies, etc.
So this whole idea of faking weapons of mass destruction attacks is really, this incident in Douma in 2018, this time a chemical weapon attack supposedly by the President Assad's government, which actually wasn't. I mean, it was all faked. It's very reminiscent, isn't it, of the fake weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was used as the excuse to go in there in 2003 into that illegal war, and basically we've got a similar situation here, at least an attempt to do the same in Syria, with all these missile strikes that were launched by the French, the British, and the Americans straight after this fake news attack, weapons of mass destruction back in 2018. Also outside international law. So really what we seem to be dealing with here is a bunch of international criminals who want to try to break international law by attacking countries and then persuading their own domestic populations here in the West, using the mass media, that this is all fine and okay because certain individual, whether it's Saddam or President Assad, has been using WMD against their own people. Now, the same, of course, was used against Colonel Gaddafi. saying that he was attacking his own people, and that was used as an excuse to attack Libya. So this is really history repeating itself with the criminals in the West trying to get these wars started. Now, what was the purpose of all of this? Well, it seems to be following the Yinon plan. He was an Israeli general, and he was saying that we need to have all these various attacks on Middle Eastern countries in order to destabilize the Middle East, to balkanize the Middle East. But I think at the end of the day, you could also look upon this as just resource grabs, the attempt of the West with a massive military that it can't really justify to its own population, sitting around. They don't want them twiddling their thumbs, so they want to involve them in invasions. And these media operations are the Trojan horse in the mind of the Western public, which allows them to just get away with criminal acts. And so that's why this is so important. And Peter Hitchens, who's put this complaint into the BBC, myself, I complain to the BBC from time to time. I never hear anything in the national press about it because Peter Hitchens has got a column in the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. They know that they can't just get away with fudging it. It's journalists like me, real investigative journalists like me, who find that because we don't have much of an outlet, obviously I do here on Press TV, but Press TV is banned in the UK, that we find that that those sorts of complaints to the BBC generally get sidelined or ignored, but they realise they cannot ignore Peter Hitchens' complaint on this occasion. And the big problem with this documentary on the radio, first of all, Chloe Hadjamajud, can't even pronounce her surname. In the world of journalism in Britain, nobody's ever heard of this woman. She's come out of nowhere to produce this fake news report. But what she's been doing is an actual, it's well known in journalism as a line that you should never cross. That is, she has put words into the mouth of her source from the OPCW. Okay. And that's really the crux of this complaint, is that Alex, this guy from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, actually never said what she said he said. So it is fake news, and a worst thing about this particular type of fake news, the idea is this is an excuse to start a war. So that's why it's such an important complaint, and well done for Peter Hitchens and the Mail on Sunday for pointing the finger at the BBC as the propagandists they are, and warmongers too, also trying to include WikiLeaks as part of the scam that they're trying to run. So attacking real journalists, propagandists attacking the real journalists in Britain.
Right. Well, you mentioned a lot of things there. We're going to get into some of the WikiLeaks stuff and other points that you made there, Tony Gosling. But John Bosnitch, I'd like to get this straight because it's confusing, and I'm sure the viewer wants to know this. When you have something like this happen, a documentary being made, and there to be inaccuracies, as the BBC has confessed, it's not as if the person making the documentary just decided on his or her own initiative to include fictional pieces in there. There must have been some directives there. So you got that on the one hand, I'm guessing, and on the other hand, I'm wondering if this is actually happening within the military ranks of the people making decisions, whether they're getting faulty information, whether intended or not. So if you can paint that picture for us.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to congratulate my fellow real journalist for his comments preceding mine, because he's covered all of the key touch points in this story. That's the first point. Secondly, I can share with you my own experience as a war reporter, having covered military conflicts for approximately 1 decade in various countries. I can tell you that any time that the military-industrial complex of a country can provoke a conflict through the lying mainstream media, and there's a reason why that expression exists. Whenever they can do that, it pays very, very well to do so. It not only sells weapons, it continues the basic system of war as the first response. There's no need for an inquiry. There's no need for an investigation, because the media monopolies in the Western warmonger countries, and I'm sorry to say that because I was born in one and grew up in one of those countries in Canada, but those countries are led by an elite which is responsible to no one. They simultaneously control the military-industrial complex, and they buy up the media through the resources of the military-industrial complex. So what the military-industrial complex does is it provokes incidents. It creates scenarios by which incidents could take place. It hands those scenarios over to its intelligence services like the CIA. As in the case, we can give many instances over the years, but Adolf Hitler used a fake news story about Poland invading Germany in order to start his war on Poland. We know that the Americans used the fake Gulf of Tonkin incident to provoke their entry and their further activity in Vietnam. We know for a fact, I was actually there as a reporter on the scene, that the so-called Račak incident, which was reported as a Serbian massacre in Kosovo, was faked, and we know that it was promoted and called a massacre by the CIA agent operating in Kosovo on behalf of America. So this is not a new tactic. In fact, I would have to say this is the oldest tactic in the book. And the fact that the military-industrial complex is able to so easily infiltrate the media, and that's what they do. They infiltrate the media. There are honest journalists in the media, but they do not control the means of publication. They submit stories, the editors accept or reject the stories, and the stories go forward. When the editors and the publishers get an order from their secret intelligence services telling them that a story needs to be placed, they place it, or they're replaced. That's how the media works in this current system. The media is not responsible to the people, and when the military uses a media fake news, and I want to go further than fake news, because fake news can be intentionally fake, or it can just be fake through incompetence. These incidents are always intentional. They are pre-planned conspiracies to use the media to allow a freedom of hand, a freedom to make war that is not constitutionally available in the countries that make those wars.
Sure.
And that is the main thing that's happening here.
Tony Gosling, this has been rehashed in the past, and that is the role that the OPCW played in this whole alleged chemical attacks, accusing the Syrian government and Russian forces perhaps of executing it. And if you can tell us the role that the OPCW played, because there have been obviously allegations made here against them that they have sidestepped concerns about the controversial investigation into that attack, and even accusing the body of accepting unsubstantiated or possibly to have manipulated findings. Do you see the OPCW to be guilty of that?
Well, look, the OPCW is what I would call a point of struggle. It's one of those international organisations which is absolutely critical to stopping this kind of attack. But it's an organisation which is very much in the crosshairs of the Western military. They want to control that organisation because they know that if they can get them to make statements, I mean, we've seen, for example, the way the International Olympic Committee, as another international body, has been used as a stick with which to beat Russia over doping. All countries pretty much use doping, but Russia was singled out for that purpose because it's part of the Operation Beluga, which is Western NATO intelligence service operation in order to discredit Putin and discredit Russia in the Western press. So, that's the sort of thing that is going on in the OPCW. But I'd like to also point to the specific organisation, the White Helmets, which was used in this documentary. The boss of those supposedly committed suicide, although it looks very clear, if you look at the evidence, that the money for the White Helmets was coming through British intelligence, through MI6, and this was really just an intelligence front. So So what the British intelligence were doing was they created a so-called humanitarian organisation equipped with video cameras to go out there and actually to work for British intelligence to deliver stories to the British mainstream news night after night, which would be favourable to the British view that there needed to be regime change in Syria. So this was a propaganda attempt, and this is the information that was picked up partly in this documentary. But more importantly, I'd just like to explain to your viewers how it works here in Britain, that a so-called independent media, state-run media, like the BBC and others, of course, can report in such a biased way a complete fake news story designed to start a war. And that is because we have a unit in Britain called the 77th Brigade, which is a psychological warfare, what they call information operations brigade. It's a rather large army formation put together for psychological warfare purposes. And whilst their own serving members in that brigade and in those offices putting all sorts of fake news out in the mass media and elsewhere, and actually on the internet, the idea is also to get people sharing these memes up on social media, is that there are quite a number of retired army officers who are now working within the mainstream press. So, this has happened over the last 50, 60 years. Quite a lot of, for example, from World War II, officers from the forces then went in the 1950s, 60s and 70s to work in the media in Britain. But they are reservists still for the army, and they're working within the media here in the West. And what happens is they get a phone call from the 77th Brigade. Hey, we got a great exclusive for you here. And there it goes, straight into a news bulletin, or a documentary gets commissioned based on what is effectively an army intelligence operation, a military operation, in order to get whatever story it is they want out there. And that, of course, can be casus belli for a new war. And the idea is really to hoodwink the British public, hoodwink the Western public for as long as it takes to commit the crime to get the war started. Sure. And the 77th Brigade have no such oversight such as the BBC have. So I think that the next step really needs to be to get the 77th Brigade to explain its role in this fake news that was also a war crime.
Are the officials known? Are they known to give interviews? Can you make a request? I'm just asking if that's possible or not.
Request, but the idea that they're going to fess up, put their hands up and say, yes, it was us. We used our army officers within the media in order to plant this story. I'm afraid you're going to get nowhere with that sort of request.
Here's the math here, John Bosnitch. I was surprised at this. Again, since it's somewhat dated. You have 20 unresolved issues in Syria's chemical weapons file of declarations that have been made. You have the UN and the OPCW. They have officially attributed 8 of those chemical weapons attack to the Syrian regime, as they say. So you got 20, 8 of them is towards the Syrian regime. That leaves, what, 12 that the terrorists have done. So when you take a look at the math there,
even if we,
and how that's obviously much greater than the 8 if the Syrian government is actually, they did execute it, it's a huge question mark and a huge doubt on the Syrian government. Because to this day, we still have these terrorists, these Daesh terrorists say there's going to be a chemical attack. Russia makes that announcement. Give us your feedback on just this particular piece of stat.
Okay, of the 20 that you're referring to, I would guess, everything starts with a guess that you have to check, but I would guess that 0 were committed by the Syrian government. Why? Why do I guess that? Because before you analyze, and I worked as a journalist and a government advisor in Canada and in Japan. First, you have to analyze the basic news story and ask yourself, who would benefit from this news? Obviously, the main beneficiaries of any news that Syria is doing anything illegal are the Western NATO powers that were trying to topple illegally, by force of arms, the government of Syria. So, once we see a news story that only can possibly benefit the opponents of the Syrian government, we have to look at that news story with deep suspicion. Because a balanced news story will quote the government in detail, and it will quote the accusers in detail. And if you check the BBC and you check CNN, you will find that as a general rule, they give 10 times, and that's a real figure, 10 times more information against and they use the word regime. They don't refer to the Syrian government. So that's a telltale signal right away. The minute you see a report from Western media that refers to the regime of Syria, or the regime of Donbass, or the regime of some place, you know that you're reading a biased report, especially when it refers to English government sources, in the same sentence in which it refers to Syrian government sources as Syrian regime sources. So a cursory glance at a news report will usually tell you whether it's propaganda or not. Then as you go past these first telltale signs, which are always there, then you look to see if they use a resort to authority. So BBC will republish information from Germany, or they will republish information from the CNN, and CNN will republish information from Germany and BBC, and so on, so that they pretend to say, our fellow independent journalists have reported this, and that's always false. Mm-hmm. As a general rule, that's always false. Okay. So we've got something that is not just false by accident, it's false by design. And when something is false by design, it should be investigated immediately. And any military action to follow a press report has to be followed first by a public inquiry. Sure. Because this carte blanche is the way wars are started, and this is the way millions of people are killed.
Exactly.
Not dozens.
And that brings me to my last question. I mean, Tony Gosling, something's got to be done. I mean, to carry some placards by some people saying, you know, stop lying or stop this propaganda is not going to be enough, I'm guessing. Because we're looking at a world where there are threats being made. There are threats being made against the Islamic Republic by the U.S. And we know how the U.S. and the U.K. work together. The U.S. focused on China.
Lawsuits.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I think that the proper recourse is to at least sue the BBC for the damages incurred as a result of its false report on the ground in Syria in the World Court. That means tens of millions of dollars of damage, not counting the lives lost.
That sounds like a good idea. Even maybe more so, if you can tell us, Tony Gosling, what more can be done. Again, we're looking at a world where it's filled with military thoughts, and it's, you know, a lot of it is coming from the U.S. The focus on China, the threats being made against Iran. Biden just last week used the word options when Naftali Bennett visited him. So what can be done to prevent this, at least for the general public to be aware and to comb their psyche so that they don't fall to the trap of the media like it happened with the BBC doc?
Well, look, it's a very difficult question to answer. What can be done? Because the deep state has a great deal of clout and control of the media, as well as, of course, much of the Parliament here in the UK, for example. I think what is a fascinating little smoking gun in this crooked fake news documentary the BBC put out trying to smear Assad is the way they also tried to smear Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in the same report, because as many people know, Julian Assange is on the record as explaining absolutely right and factually that the only way that wars can start is through lies. And he saw it as his life's mission as an investigative journalist, probably one of the most important publishers on the planet, to scotch those lies. And it's no accident that he is now in jail here in Britain, actually, even though he hasn't actually committed any offence here in the UK. So I think one of the ways we could do something to stop this is to force, through legal means or whatever, I don't know how you're going to do it, but to get Julian Assange
Sorry, I got to jump in. I do apologize, Tony Gosling. We're just fresh out of time. But thank you. Some great comments there made by Tony Gosling, activist, historian, investigative journalist, and a former BBC employee. And thank you so much, John Bosnitch, journalist and political analyst. Wish we had more time.
Pleasure.
And that does it for this edition of The Spotlight.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in from Ikawa Tagway. It's goodbye.